Hello, and welcome to Introducing Me. I'm your host, Sarah. I started this podcast to get to know other people and lifestyles while discovering more about myself. Each episode, I will give a new guest a chance to discuss their background, culture, interests, or whatever they want to talk about to help increase all of our own worldviews. Today, I would like to introduce you to Brett Moyer. He grew up in central Pennsylvania, and since graduating college, he has been working in finance near New York City, but he's always had a passion for history, and he has recently published a few books, including a picture book. He's got other things going on that he's done in his life, so I'm excited to have Brett here today. Thank you so much, Brett. Why don't you go ahead and tell the audience a little bit more about you?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah, for having me. Definitely, amazed to be on the list of all the authors that you've been able to interview and have on your show. So, as you mentioned, my name is Brett Moyer, originally from Watsontown, Pennsylvania, a town of about 2,300 people, just along the beautiful banks of the Susquehanna River. And as Sarah mentioned, I graduated from Susquehanna back in 2013. I was a finance and econ major. And, always had a bit of an interest for business, but also a very big passion for history. And, coming out of college, I did the corporate route, ended up with, JP Morgan, spending 2 years in Delaware, the beautiful state of Delaware. And then I was able to transition with them up to New York and never lived in New York City. Always lived in Jersey City, just along the Hudson River there as well. And was very fortunate to spend a good career with them, growing within the finance space and then project management before then going over to Goldman Sachs for a little over a year. And then currently I'm a vice president at Bank of New York Mellon, where I oversee a large project management endeavor for them, especially improving the liquidity space. So, it's really interesting to be interviewed about other things beyond finance. I feel like I often do phone calls with students or, I've done different lectures and it's always just business, always just finance. But I've often kind of said there's more to people than their job title and their career. So that's what's really exciting today is to, talk more about all those other passions that, definitely make a person much more unique, much more interesting. So, as Sarah mentioned, I've done 2 history books over the last 2 years. And then I also expanded into children's books recently. I just came out with my first one back in August, and the next one will come out in about 2 weeks. So
This episode will be releasing probably right around the book coming out, because for once I am ahead on my recording.
There you go.
So I'm curious, did you ever think to not go into finance and go into the business world and take some sort of career in more of a history fashion?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, growing up in central PA, there's so much amazing history. And, I think it also stems back to, when I was 4 years old, I was starting work at my parents' bed and breakfast, which is also a restaurant, which was located in Lewisburg. It was Brook Park Farms. And I remember getting my very first tip, $2. I was carrying the water pitcher and topping off water glasses. And, and the bed and breakfast was situated in an old farmhouse. And all the old pictures were on the walls, and many of the patrons who would come for lunch were either pastors or clergymen or women or just really interesting people, professors. And, from a young age, I was surrounded with history. And, the other irony of becoming an author, and part of the reason I really wanted to pursue that, is I really struggled to learn to read as a child. I was probably 6, 7-ish when I started really to read. And the very first books that intrigued me and I just started picking up were biographies from the school library. And, it was always a very big passion for me to the point that, when I ended up, was 10 years old, I joined the Warrior on Fort Freeland Heritage Society. And, from a young age there, I would carry the water buckets around on my shoulders or deliver firewood for the annual Heritage Days in October every year. So just the opportunity to put yourself into character go back to the Revolutionary War, and see, what battles and things happened right there in sleepy old central Pennsylvania. And it became such a unique passion of mine that, even getting into high school, I ended up taking on the trade of becoming a rake maker. Cutting down the tree and, using a shaving horse and hand tools to take, this piece of cherry wood and turn it into a hay rake and a pitchfork. So this was a really unique experience for me where over time I would grow into being a master craftsman and getting to teach these apprentices. And even through high school, I was having this debate, do I become a history teacher or do I go the route of a business? Because, growing up in that, family business, waiting tables, I was also fortunate to understand, the value of money. So I'd begun, at a young age, putting away all my tips. And, the very first stock that I was able to purchase, I was very interested, in learning stock symbols. And I had, been saving my money at West Melton State Bank, which is now Susquehanna Community Financial. And I thought they may be a broker. I didn't understand how that worked as a young person. I remember going into the branch and, they said, well, we're not, but, we could issue you stock. And, I was really fortunate to turn, my early tips into shares of stock and gain to see that grow. And, one of my first jobs, outside of waiting tables was a bank teller at West Melton. So, I had these parallel, interests going where, a little bit entrepreneurial, loving history, loving learning and talking to people. And, getting accepted at Susquehanna, I didn't quite know where I was going to go. I went in as an undecided business major. And, the amazing thing was, finance was something that was kind of big, is one of the majors there. I thought, well, let me give that a shot. And I went through the entire program, as a finance major and did well. I took on internships at Prudential and JP Morgan. But I always laugh a little bit where I was the TA for all the entrepreneurship classes. And I never took a single entrepreneurship class in all my years, but just was asked by the business school to be the TA and help students write business plans and figure out ways to finance their small ventures. And so something where, I always go back to, I went that finance route, particularly because I enjoy people. I always enjoy getting to talk to people, learning from them, seeing what their passions really are. I think it's a really unique opportunity to encourage them to push themselves and truly become, what they've been destined to be. So, that's why I went the finance route. But in that same vein, I never lost that passion for history. I was very fortunate when I moved from Delaware up to Jersey City. I found myself missing the opportunity to stay engaged with history. When you're in the city every day, everything is clean and sleek and modern. But then when you're walking down the street, you see this beautiful old building, or you see, the Statue of Liberty and, these unique pieces of history. And, about 6 months into my time up in the city, I realized I was bored on weekends. And I decided to just send a random email to the National Park Service at the Statue of Liberty, asking if I could volunteer. And, they immediately got back and said, we do not have a need for volunteers, but there's a nonprofit, Ellis Island, who would like to arrange to have tour guides to give tours of the abandoned immigrant hospitals. And for some context, my family did not come in through Ellis Island. I had no connection. I often tell my guests the joke on the story that, as a young child, I was on a cruise out of New York Harbor, and I remember asking my dad what the buildings were at Ellis Island on the south side, these old abandoned ruins. And I remember he told me that he assumed that they were office buildings. And now that I take guests through them, I realize that there are these amazing, magnificent hospitals on the island. So it was just a really unique opportunity for me to volunteer and to give back. And part of the reason I really needed that, is I am an introvert, and doing my podcast, right now talking with people. It's interesting to me in that regard. But and I say I enjoy meeting and talking to people, but I am quite introverted. And being a tour guide in New York, you have to be very much an extrovert. You have to hold attention. You have people who are coming to the city from all over the world. And I begun taking groups of 30 people through these abandoned hospitals wearing hard hats and learning this amazing part of history that I never had any idea about, and how this was really the cutting edge of healthcare in America. And, lo and behold, almost 7 years later, I've had the pleasure of giving thousands of tours in those buildings and getting to see, different reactions from guests and people who've been through, the immigration process. It's really inspiring. And then, to counter that, there's a lot of other amazing history in New York. And a little bit of an unknown fact is I do give running tours of Lower Manhattan. So I actually lead, groups on a 5-mile run across the Brooklyn Bridge and around the New York Stock Exchange and talk about the early parts of American history. This is pre-Ellis Island. But just once again, an ability to have that outlet outside of corporate finance is something I like to encourage even students today when I meet with them from Susquehanna is, don't give up your day job, especially early on. If you have that passion for business, if you have that passion for finance and numbers, go for it. Don't be afraid, but don't let that corporate or that career take away from that God-given gift that you have. Because for many people, it could be art, it could be music, it could be history. Find that outlet and continue with it, and not to say it's the gig economy or this, this outlet for these challenges you're facing on a daily basis, but we've all been given unique gifts and abilities that we should continue to enjoy and see, how we can impact others through. So that's why history is really such an important part of my life, because, even from a young age, it's always been ingrained and ensconced in kind of what I've done. And it's just been a great way for me to interact with others.
Yeah, it really sounds like it. And you've shared a lot there. So I'm curious to know, did you ever think about going to college somewhere that's not like less than an hour from your hometown?
So when I went to Moyer in high school, in Watsontown, I had applied other places. I applied to Pittsburgh, I applied to Delaware, and then even closer to home, I applied to Bloomsburg University, and all really unique options. But I go back to, I was a little bit of an introvert. I was a little bit shy, and this idea of going too far away just didn't seem to make too much sense to me. When I was younger, I often thought, I would probably end up staying with West Milton State Bank and seeing where my career went with them. And, it's funny to think, and I often remember, as a bank teller, when I was there, they had, at the time, 4 branches and about 80 employees. So you always knew who to talk to. There was no bureaucracy, no hierarchy. It was very easy to navigate. And I remember my first internship at Prudential. I was there as a financial analyst, and they had almost 40,000 employees. And I was asked to email someone, and I'm like, how in the world do I find this person to email? And that was just mind-numbing to me. And, it was a little scary. That's why I'm like, I miss my comforts of home in that regard. And, I thought, well, I'm going to college for finance. Well, I was at Prudential. It wasn't quite, it was more of an accounting role. And I thought, I want to go with the big banks and see if that allows me to potentially go into the branch banking, kind of like what I was doing with West Milton. And that ended up steering me to JP Morgan, because I knew JP Morgan Chase and the Chase brand. But when I ended up interning there, I was really just JP Morgan in-house. I was a financial controller. And when I was at JPM, I was now with 250,000 people. So kind of once again in that wrong direction of being in that comfort zone of always knowing who to ask questions to and what to do. And, it's continued to allow me to really step out of that comfort zone where I interact with now hundreds of people every day. And especially as a project manager, you're dealing with stakeholders, large and small, across the firm. I primarily look at the markets business for Bank of New York, and I'm dealing with many different vendors, with the firm. So it's continued to be a unique opportunity to push myself where you have to deal with all these people. You're not into the small numbers anymore, which is definitely interesting. So.
And now, do you like living in Jersey City, close to the city, or do you sometimes wish you were back in rural central Pennsylvania?
Yeah, Jersey City, it's much quieter than New York. I'm very thankful to be across the Hudson River. My wife and I often talk. I never will forget the day that COVID really set in New York. At that time, I was at Goldman Sachs, and I remember, I was standing with one of the vice presidents at the window, and the Goldman office looks down the West Side Highway. And it was Tuesday in March of 2020. And, I remember we were looking out the window and the West Side Highway was quiet. And it's never that way. And I remember, he's an older gentleman. He said, life will never be the same. He said, that the future will probably be hybrid, which was really interesting, the hindsight that he had. He said that people in these big office buildings in New York will probably just be executives going forward. And then, hours later, we got the email to go home. And, I remember going into the Oculus World Trade Center, and there was a little farmer's market. And every Tuesday they would have this farmer's market. And I thought, well, I don't know when the last time I'm going to be here again. So I remember I bought 2 loaves of bread that day, thinking, well, this will be just 2 weeks. I'll be back in the city. No big deal. And, that same day, the email came out that restaurants would be closed at midnight that night. And I remember texting my wife, and she saved the message where I said, should we go get our last meal at a restaurant? And she said, how morbid is this? And I said, no, you don't understand. The restaurants are closing. And I said, I don't know when they'll reopen. But and lo and behold, we could not find a restaurant that was open that night in the city. And I just remember coming home to Jersey, and it was amazing to see during COVID how just the city kind of shut down. Jersey City was scary in that regard. You didn't want to press elevator buttons. You just wanted to be away. And, part of me during that time was saying, man, I would love to be on a farm, back home and away from all this scariness that's happening. You didn't know, the grocery stores were empty. You had to wait in line, 50 people long to get into the stores. And you were just afraid to go out. You were afraid, were you going to catch COVID? And, in all those moments, and even prior to, I thought, I'm definitely ready to be away from the city. Back in central Pennsylvania, where I know everybody, things are simple. You just get in your car. You don't worry about touching the subway poles and things. But through that, my wife and I have always talked that, that there's a purpose for us to be here. And, even in reading, our daily devotionals that, God has a purpose for us here. It's not time to leave yet. And, and part of that has been, during COVID, with our church, we've helped run a number of engagement events and community service events. And it's really remarkable how, we were able to see COVID was really hard on people in the city. I remember, some of the analysts I worked with at Goldman who they were young and single during COVID in their studio apartments, and they were going out of their minds. They had no social life. They had no one to talk to. And, and that's something they often say about New York City. It's a place where everyone is, but it can be a very lonely place. And that's something where I think we've been very fortunate in trying to engage people, and helping them through that transition. I think COVID, in the cities really changed a lot of people, and tried to, build that community back, I think is really important for people, and just trying to make sure that they have that level of engagement. So to answer your question, I definitely miss rural life. Absolutely. And, and part of that is the history, passion that I have, where I always want to just be working with my hands. I love the ability to garden if I could. And, it's just something that it is definitely on the horizon. hopefully sooner rather than later, where, my wife and I will be able to settle down and have some property of some nature. And one of those areas where, being on the Hudson River has offered us a really unique insight where there's tons of Canada geese and tons of ducks and diving ducks and a lot of wildlife, which is really amazing. And, one of the service events that we've been engaged with our church has been doing a community service day. And we've seen, unfortunately, a lot of the trash in the Hudson River and the impact that has had on the ecosystem. And, I joke with my wife, she's from the Philippines and, very warm climate, certainly no Canada geese whatsoever. But when she moved here and, was coming to Jersey City, she found these little goslings every spring and immediately fell in love with them. I mean, it's a little yellow gosling. Who couldn't love that? And, getting to see them quickly grow into these 20-pound Canada geese. And, it was really a passion of ours every day just to watch them, see just their interaction, just how smart they were, and also their sense of family and community. And, unfortunately, over time, we were noticing some sick geese. They were limping or, some of them they weren't eating anymore. They were showing some issues like that. And we began to try to figure out ways to help them. And, she ran across the Wild Bird Fund, NYC, which is a nonprofit in New York. And their objective is to be a wing over wildlife in New York City. No pun intended there. And, she got connected with them. And I remember the very first time I watched her capture a sick Canada goose, just how the confidence to go in behind a goose, just be able to wrap your arms around it, and then put it inside of a box and, transporting it into New York City was really remarkable. And it gave me that quick sense and that quick jolt that there is a sense of more rural living here in that capacity. And being able to help wildlife and help nature. And, it is amazing to look at Jersey City. It's a little bit less developed, just a little bit less developed than New York, but they do have a little bit more of a nature setting, some of the bigger parks here and things. And, that has given me some sense of that country living that we've missed. And, we've had some success with some of the geese that we've been able to help rescue. The big problem here, especially in the Hudson River, is typically lead poisoning or some other chemical issues where there was a swan covered in petroleum, unfortunately, from spilled oil. And, unfortunately, this July, there was a goose struck by an Uber Eats delivery driver. And, my wife and I got the call one night from someone else who kind of watches out for the geese and called us. And at the time, we just gotten a corgi puppy. So we had a big enough carrier to put this goose in. And, unfortunately, at that time, the Wild Bird Fund, it was late at night. Their operating room was closed. So we unfortunately had to hold that goose until morning was the objective. So my wife and I were talking through this process of how we were going to make sure this goose survived. Unfortunately, 2 hours in, the goose passed peacefully in its crate, but it was really traumatic, just seeing how just a lack of indifference almost in the community here, not necessarily a full awareness that, the big thing we were running into was people had made assumptions that it's a goose, it should have flown out of the way. And, why are there so many geese here? Just this not necessarily being educated about it. And, my wife and I talked, and I said, well, people don't know about molting, which occurs to all geese, typically every, June into July, where they all, they can't fly and they grow new feathers, and they don't understand the goslings are here, their nests are here on the Hudson River. So, I'd been a history author for 2 years, and my books have typically been about kind of what if scenarios. And, I had just finished my book on Ellis Island, and I thought, it's going to be a while until I have my next one. So I thought, let's try a children's book. Let's try to educate city folks about nature a little bit. So I thought, I like to draw. It's not necessarily something I'd done in years, but I thought, I bet I can draw my own book and illustrate. And in 750 words, I bet I could teach a young child about geese and just some of the fun facts. And it really was an amazing success. Adults who would pick up the books for their kids were like, I didn't know some of these things. And like, I didn't know you shouldn't feed them bread. I'd love to just take an old piece of bread and feed it to the ducks and the geese. And now I know it's not good for them. So like those little things are really fascinating where it's really crossed so many lines of, people from the city get to learn more, get to respect that nature. People back home, are amazed to learn about these Canada geese that they see fly over every year. And it's just been a really unique opportunity where I've still been able to embrace that country living through, what will be this series now called Goose Gather Farm. And, the book coming out in a couple weeks, the title will be Meet Honey the Bee. And I'm trying to educate people about honeybee populations and some of the important factors about them, and just how critical they are to our food supply and everything else in life. And that was kind of spun in my mind. At Bank of New York, on the roof of the building, they have beehives. And it's actually quite common in the city to put these honeybee hives on the roofs and, supporting the local ecosystem. And I thought this will be a great book, too, in that series. And in trying to also, work in this unique perspective for children and adults to learn a little bit through these interactions. So.
Well, I don't think most people would expect a VP in finance to be so passionate about geese and wildlife to the point of writing this book and, having this little series. So can you talk a little bit about the first books that you wrote and how you first took that plunge into, I'm going to publish a book?
Yeah. So, going back to the winter of 2020, I guess, I was a little over a year in at Goldman Sachs, and, it was very funny. I think it was November 1 of that year. I was asked by Susquehanna to give this talk to students, and it was like a primetime address. It was like a Thursday night, 7 p.m. I think there was like 200 or 300 people listened in, alumni, students. And the dean of the business school, Dean Razoo, entitled my talk, Finding Your Dream Job. And I remember, when I was planning to give this talk, I actually was a little bit hesitant because I thought, finance necessarily isn't my dream job. And I joked about that a little bit that night, that there are days it's a nightmare. Some days it's great, But, I really tried to encourage students and alumni alike, once again, follow your passions, see what God's trying to do with you in your life. It's not all about the career or the title. And I remember leaving it that night, not thinking too much of it. Hopefully there's some lessons. And, about a month later, I had a calendar invite from my managing director put on my calendar that also included the partner of my division. And I got a little nervous. I thought, well, this is a unique meeting to have scheduled. And, I got the call that night that my job was being transitioned to India. And I had a month to transition the work and I was going to be done. But they said, you will have a severance package and you can see where you'll go from there. And, at that moment I was in shell shock. I've never been laid off, and it was just a very weird transition, very kind of quick. And, Goldman was a really amazing company. I thought, I'm getting laid off from the best bank in the world. And in that moment, I didn't know what to do with my days, obviously from, talking today, and I'm sure what the listeners will hear is I have a lot of interesting passions. I don't like downtime. And I remember just staying at home, I didn't know where I was going to go next in my career. I was just all over the place. And, I'd said to my wife previously, I had an interest in, Abraham Lincoln and, the Civil War and, the Industrial Revolution. And I said, I was always curious, what if he hadn't been assassinated? And she said, you should write something about this. Maybe it could be the book that, you've often thought about writing. And, over the course of 6 weeks, I just sat down and started doing research and started writing. And, I thought, well, I don't know where this is going to go. And, I contacted some publishers and, self-publishing, it's not cheap in a lot of cases. If you want to go with one of the big groups, you typically pay them, it's thousands of dollars. And I thought, I don't want to pay them to do this. This just seems crazy to me. I don't think it's ever going to go anywhere. So I was really fortunate to see that Amazon has a self-publishing division called Kindle Create. And it puts the author really in the driver's seat, where I get to upload my manuscript. I make the cover, and manage a lot of the control around the distribution and the marketing. And it took me back to, once again, combining those passions of business and history, where, I had to be the entrepreneur and figure out where my costs had to be and what type of cover I could do. And, so during that time of uncertainty, it was just a really unique bright spot where I thought, I guess I can publish a book and see where this goes. And, I was amazed in my first month, 45 books shipped to places all over the world, which was really interesting. Books were shipping to Mexico and to the Philippines. And it was just really interesting to me to watch this. And, during this period, we were still in COVID. And, I was very thrilled with my first book, Had Lincoln Lived, and how it was doing. But I remember speaking to one of the members in our Bible study, and he joked with me. He said, well, you need to do another book. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, if you only do one, you're a one-hit wonder. But if you do multiple, you're a real author. And I thought, well, makes sense, And so I couldn't come up with any ideas. It wasn't writer's block. I just had absolutely no ideas. What would I write about next? And, during COVID, Ellis Island tours had shut down, which was kind of ironic. We were like medical historians at Ellis Island. We had a lot to talk about, certainly. But I noticed, I was losing a lot of those facts that I had learned so much about, and I've read so many books about medical history, not only at Ellis Island, but at Bellevue and really across America and even across the world. It's a really fascinating topic going back millennia. And I thought I should write about Ellis Island. It's something that, the buildings there that we give tours through, the objective of the nonprofit was to raise $500 million to restore them. And that was years ago that quote was given. So I'm sure it's probably approaching $1 billion, if not more. And the funds will never likely be raised, unfortunately. It's one of those challenges where the goal really now is what's called arrested decay, is to just stop the buildings from falling down, basically. And I thought, this is history that is going to be lost. And I thought, it's time that I write this story because it needs written, it needs told. And, I quickly sat down and just wrote all these facts and all these stories that I've heard and read into a book. And it was really enjoyable to actually proof that book with my wife, because we sat down and read through it. And it literally felt like I was walking the tour out again, and I walked backwards on those tours so I can see everyone. And it was a really cathartic experience for me to actually go back through and think about those rooms I've walked into, the spaces that are off limits typically to public tours, and to talk about the morgue and talk about the doctors and the nurses and the staff and just the immigrant experience that went on there. And, that was just a really amazing opportunity for me to tell that story. But once again, from the perspective, what if? What if Ellis Island had never been more than a pile of rocks, a small little island in the harbor, to paint this picture, not necessarily, how bad healthcare would have been, but also how bad immigration, how troublesome it could have been without that safety net, of making sure everyone coming into the country was healthy and safe and well. It really made immigration a much smoother process, made America, a much more thriving economy, and also a world player. I talk later about even World War II. that ability to make sure that all these people were healthy and well going off to war, were not malnourished. And so many immigrants coming to America were poor farmers, and just trying to make sure that they understood these basic concepts. And that was a really wonderful experience to get into those history books. And, and moving into the children's book, it's partly because my next history book, hopefully, will be on what if General MacArthur had not retaken the Philippines during World War II. And, partly because, my wife is from the Philippines, but he's just such a controversial general, statesman figure, however you want to look at him, throughout his career. And, it's really amazing to look at, how he lost the Philippines, and that was such a difficult situation early in World War II. But just his victory in retaking it, and how it set him up to help restabilize Japan, as really the commander, post World War II, and bring that world, back into a stable place, bring their economy and the country back to a democratic state. And then, even the efforts in the Korean War, and how, communism was such a threat during that period. And, without his leadership, during that, how history could have been so much different in Asia and then around the world, just those efforts to stabilize, just those small little islands had such ripple effects. But I quickly know, from, early research that will be such a work in progress, not an easy write in any way, where I said, I want to stay relevant as an author, stay active. And then that's when I quickly realized I have this passion for environmentalism. And, and that's where I said the kids' books, children's books are a really amazing outlet. It's a great way to connect with a segment that I never really thought about before, and to really, expand my genres. So.
And so you shared a little bit how this kind of came out during pandemic times and with the job changes and everything. So how has life changed since March of 2020?
Yeah. So, I think since, COVID has started, I often think I can't fathom going back into an office 5 days a week. That's the big thing. And that's kind of the wonderful side in a way coming out of COVID is so many people have realized that the hybrid model does work. There are certainly those great days where it is good to be in an office, having those face-to-face interactions and meetings. But, having that ability to now be at home 2-3 days a week has certainly given, that flexibility to pursue those passions where, if I've gotten my work done for the day, I could sit down and now draw, or I could read, a research paper on something that is interesting to me. And then even at Bank of New York and many of the other banks now, they have programs called Work from Anywhere, where for 2 weeks out of the year, you can go and work remotely. So this past May, my wife and I went back to the Philippines for 2 weeks and, worked New York hours, so worked overnight, but had that flexibility to get to see the world, do a little bit of preliminary research about MacArthur, kind of get those ideas flowing. So I think one of the great things of being hybrid is it's really allowed people to pursue those passions, on those days where they may not have to be in the office, where when you're in the office, you're interacting with people who are focused on that same objective, same motive. And, when you get to be outside, you now get to be in your own community, perhaps, and engaging people who, have fellow historians, people who, fellow authors, and, even with our church, engaging in those community events, people from all different segments of life. It's really been a great asset and a great blessing in a way to have that ability now to see once again that there's so much more outside of just that corporate 9 to 5 days a week, every day. So.
Yes, and it sounds like you've really been able to adjust to that new reality, and you've been able to take advantage of the 2 weeks of work from anywhere. Do you have any hopes for future 2 weeks work from anywhere?
Yeah, I mean, I'm somewhat in favor of, the hybrid and the remote work. I don't know where it's going to lead us, perhaps in that regard. My hope is a little bit further away from the city, and being able to have a little bit more of a suburban life, and that way people could to get back to those roots, the agrarian kind of understanding, and be a little bit more flexible in that regard. So.
And do you enjoy your commute into the city when you have to go in?
Not so much. It's something where, I'll be honest, I'm very fortunate where I find lower Manhattan is a lot safer, a lot cleaner. One of the shames of, going back to the pandemic was, mental health, I feel, did go through a lot of issues in New York, and just so many problems there, with crime, Asian hate crimes, and things like that, where it's definitely not the same city that I remember. Recently catching up with a colleague, we joked about how we were in shock, how we would get off the train at 33rd and walk 15 blocks in a suit 5 days a week. And we now are both fortunate where we can be downtown and, wear pretty much whatever we want. But, it's something where, it's definitely a different city than it used to be. And I just hope that the values and things can kind of come back. But, time will certainly tell, where the future will lead us there. So.
Great. Well, I'm not sure I have any more specific questions to ask you. Is there anything else that you would like to share with the listeners today?
Yeah, it was such a pleasure to get to talk to you all today. And I just want to reiterate, whatever your passions may be, wherever, God has placed you in that regard, I hope you're able to kind of pursue, that flexibility and be able to see how you can touch others' lives. We've all been given really unique gifts, and, I hope if you want to pursue finance, it's a great opportunity, working within that segment. I don't discount that in any way. If you want to be an author, that's an even more amazing market in so many ways, where you get that creative side and get to touch lives as well. So, definitely don't lose sight of where you can have an impact on others' lives. So.
Right. That's such a good piece of advice for people to hear. And I think throughout the things you've shared today, you've shown how you've been able to take that. And I think that's really good. So at the end of all of my episodes, I do ask everyone a random question. So I'll see if you have an answer for this question. It is, what is your most repeated movie quote?
My most repeated movie quote, it probably is, one of my favorite movies is Forrest Gump. And of course, the famous line, life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. And yeah, I think it's a great line. It's very, very fitting with the lives we've all been living, and definitely taking life as it comes. So.
All right, that brings this episode to a close. I will be leaving Brett's Amazon author page in the description. So if you want to check out any of the books he's talked about, you can go there and buy them, along with his upcoming soon-to-be released book that he mentioned as well. So feel free to go check that out. And if you'd like to connect with the podcast, our website is in the description as well. That brings you back to all of our past episodes and all of our social media, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. And if you'd like to support the podcast, a link to do that is available in the description as well. And of course, my email is also in the description. If you would like to be a guest, you can feel free to reach out to me. I always love hearing new stories. So thank you so much, Brett, for spending time with me today and dealing with our technical difficulties we had. I appreciate your patience. And to my listeners, for taking the time out of your day to hear a new story. Until next time, bye.
Thank you. Be well. You good.